Hi, I'm David Busch. Welcome back to Buschistory on YouTube. The website for all of these presentations is www.buschistory.net, as indicated up here, and you will be able to access all the materials we use. This is topic number 13, or Reconstruction, in my ongoing series on American history. So far, we've gone from the American Revolution through the early ages of industrialization in the United States through the American system, and then the questions about expansion and slavery, and then that caused us all to ultimately end up in the Civil War. And now the Civil War has come to an end, and the period after the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. Historians have called it Reconstruction. That time period is 1865 to 1877. Now, it's an interesting term, reconstruction, because to reconstruct something means to rebuild it. Now, generally, when you reconstruct something that's been destroyed, you build it better than it was before. There are newer techniques, there are new ways of thinking about things. When a house has been destroyed in a natural disaster, we tend to turn around and we rebuild it with better materials. So it's not exactly the same as it was before. It's improved. Primarily, Northerners call this time period Reconstruction after the Civil War. There are a lot of Southerners who don't use the word Reconstruction at all, though. They use the word Restoration. Restoration. When you restore something, you put it back exactly the way it was. And the question is it Reconstruction or is it Restoration? It's a very interesting debate. The Civil War comes to a close with the disastrous defeat of the South at the hands of Ulysses S. Grant and his policy of following Lee wherever he was going to go, and the tremendous toll it was going to take on both armies. The destruction in the South by William Tecumseh Sherman and the scorched earth policy he used, especially on his march to Savannah. We have the idea that Lincoln survives the end of the Civil War, but he dies on April 15th, just a few short days later, as a result of an assassin's bullet with John Wilkes Booth and the whole conspiracy. So what's going to happen here is we're going to attempt to bring the nation back together. But how are we going to bring it back together? Who is going to bring it back together? The number one problem that is faced during Reconstruction is what to do with 3 to 4 million people who previously had their needs taken care of by somebody else. So we have, for argument's sake, call it 3.5 million slaves. That's 3.5 million people who have a variety of needs. They have educational needs, they have social needs, they need housing. All those things need to be attended to. So a cool idea comes up. That idea is called the Freedmen's Bureau. And it's just like it sounds. Freed. And that's singular, that's M-A-N. Freedmen's Bureau. And a Freedmen's Bureau is meant to administer to the needs of the former slaves. So what we're going to have is for argument's sake, a lot of young children, let's say 9 years old. A 9-year-old black child in Alabama in 1865 and 1866 has very different needs than a 9-year-old white child in Alabama in 1865 and 1866. Sure, they both need education. There's no doubt about that. But if you have many of these children who have never been in school before, should you put them in the same school with the white people, or should you administer to their needs separately? Well, it was thought we needed schools. We needed separate schools for these people. These former slaves, they're going to end up in separate schools, and these children are going to be educated together. They're going to be educated together in black schools. Well, if you think about that for just a second, that is going to set up a system of segregation. Now, was it on purpose to segregate blacks and whites? It might have been in some cases. Was it well-intentioned? Again, it probably was well-intentioned. And who's going to teach these children? Well, they're going to be a variety of people teaching these children. They're going to be teachers from the North who are coming down to do what they consider the good Christian thing, and they're going to educate these former slaves. And there are going to be the people in the South who are going to educate them because they're looking for jobs, and they're school teachers as well. So what you're going to have is you're going to have white teachers in black schools educating the former slaves. And how are they going to educate them? What are they going to say to them? Probably, guessing, did some research on this, they're going to say, if you want to work and live in the white man's world, you need to learn certain things. You need how to get along with the white folk. You need to do what you're told. You need to learn your ABCs. And then what happens is, as this is going on, there's a subliminal message. And the message is, stay in your place. Don't do anything to aggravate or to upset white people. And this feeling of inferiority is going to be educated into this population. It really is a terrible thing that's going to come from this. But it was well-intentioned. And I don't even know what you do about that one, because there were probably people in the United States in the 1860s who were for full equality for blacks and whites. But I'm guessing that was the minority. There were many people who were against slavery, but because you were against slavery, did that mean you were for full equality? Probably not. So that's going to be a big problem as we go forth during Reconstruction. The next thing is, the South is completely destroyed and needs to be rebuilt, and a lot of resources are going to be necessary to do that. To rebuild the cities, to rebuild the farms, to rebuild the government structures of the South. That's all going to be done with Northern influence. The North is going to strive to rebuild the South as a model of itself. And there's going to be a lot of resentment that comes from that. And who shall be the local political leaders in the South? In many cases, they're former Confederate leaders. So this is going to be a real tough road here. And then this goes on to 1877. It starts with Abraham Lincoln, then it goes to Andrew Johnson, then it goes to Ulysses S. Grant, and Rutherford B. Hayes finally will become president in 1877 after making a promise to withdraw troops from the South and end Reconstruction. And when those troops are finally withdrawn from the South, who's going to be in charge? You got it. 12 years after the Civil War, the same people who were the leaders in the South before the Civil War are going to be the leaders in the South again. And we're going to head into a long period of segregation and a dual society that will not be truly addressed again until the Civil Rights Movement that begins in the 1950s and continues into the 1960s at its height. And in many cases, civil rights issues are still being addressed today. So anyway, I'm going to take a look at a series of points about the Reconstruction era with you, and I have a note set I'm going to put up here. So let me cue that up, and I'll be right back with you. There are three plans, if you like, to rebuild the nation following the Civil War. The chosen plan was Abraham Lincoln's plan. He was the commander-in-chief. He had been re-elected in 1864 in the middle of the war, granted. The only people that voted for him were Northerners, but he had still been re-elected. And he had a plan. He had a plan to bring the nation back together. And his plan was very conciliatory, a plan that you would expect from what we know about Abraham Lincoln and his attitude. Remember, from Lincoln's perspective, the Civil War was about preserving the Union. So his plan calls for, let's take a look. His plan calls for, he wants to pardon any Confederate who swore allegiance to the Union and accepted the end of slavery. Okay, so anyone in the South who swears allegiance to the Union and accepts the end of slavery, they're pardoned. By the way, I've heard people say, pardon any Confederate who pledges allegiance, meaning the Pledge of Allegiance that you and I all know. That doesn't come about for another 30 years. That Pledge of Allegiance does not exist yet. It's just an oath to the United States. Secondly, Confederate military and government officials were excluded. So if you led the Confederacy in any way, you're not going to be pardoned. You're going to be investigated and tried based on your role in the war. So everyone doesn't get off scot-free. Lincoln's not like that. And then, when 10% of the state's population had sworn allegiance, the state could write a constitution. So all you need is 10%. It's called Lincoln's 10% plan. All you needed was 10% of the people in the state. The state could write a constitution. The constitution would be submitted to the United States Congress. Congress could approve or not approve the Constitution. That Constitution had to accept the 13th Amendment, that slaves are free, and bingo, you're back in the country. Because Lincoln wanted the nation to rejoin and rebuild and come together as soon as possible. Well, we all know that that plan is not going to fly. It's going to end in April of 1865 when Lincoln dies on the morning of April 15th, 1865. And his successor, Andrew Johnson, is going to try to pull off something somewhat similar. I'm going to go into the assassination in just a minute, but I want to take a look at what Johnson was planning to do. So one sec. Let's take a look. Johnson followed many of Lincoln's basic ideas. Johnson also believed in being conciliatory, but you see, Johnson didn't secede with the rest of the South. Johnson stayed in the Senate. And he stayed in the Senate because he didn't like the planter elite. He didn't like the Southern aristocracy. He didn't like the rich guys. He didn't like the rich guys, but he's still a Southerner. He granted pardons to those who swore the oath of allegiance, 13,000 alone in 1865, and each state's constitution would have to void secession, abolish slavery, ratify the 13th Amendment, and void war debts. In other words, they couldn't owe money to each other. So this sounds very similar to Lincoln's plan. The problem is Johnson is not Lincoln. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Tennessee. He's the only Southern senator to remain in the Senate during the Civil War. So as the new President of the United States, he has several problems. Think about it. If you're a Northerner, do you trust President Andrew Johnson? Probably not, because he's a Southerner. If you're a Southerner, do you trust President Andrew Johnson? Probably not, because he's a traitor. So Andrew Johnson has nowhere to go when he becomes President of the United States. Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson in 1864 because he knew the war was coming to an end and the North was going to be victorious, and it was a conciliatory move towards the South to bring the North and the South back together. Lincoln isn't thinking, boy, when they shoot me, Andrew Johnson is going to be president. But that's not the way any president thinks when they choose their vice president. You're not thinking of your demise. Maybe you'd be smart if you did, but that's not normally the way it works. It's normally a political move to either garner votes that you wouldn't normally get, or to make some kind of overture towards a group that you're trying to please or placate. And that's what happened with Andrew Johnson. So now Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson is going to have to fulfill a lot of Lincoln's ideas. But he's going to have a really hard time doing this. And I want to take a break here. I want to take a look at the assassination. We'll come back and we'll take a look at the third plan. The third plan, by the way, is called the Wade-Davis Bill. Abraham Lincoln did not like it. President Johnson did not like it. Andrew Johnson, I almost said Lyndon Johnson. Andrew Johnson did not like it. But the radical Republicans in Congress are going to push this plan through. And you're going to see why once we take a look at the assassination details. So I'm going to pause here. I'll be right back. When we take a look at the events surrounding the Lincoln assassination, we have to be very careful. I have to be very careful to presume I know all the details. The assassination has been looked at many times by many historians over the years, and there are some accepted truths, and then there are a lot of thoughts as to what else really occurred and what didn't we know. So let's take a look at what we do know, and then you'll understand why there's a lot of resentment against the former Confederacy and the Confederate leaders once this plan reaches fruition. So here we go. Initially, the plan had been to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. They were going to kidnap him near Richmond, and they were going to hold him hostage, and they were going to ask for a ransom. That plan didn't come to play, and that plan did include the original conspirators, who I'm going to go through in a second. John Surratt, John Wilkes Booth, and company. But Lincoln didn't show up where he was supposed to, so now the plan gets changed. This is where it becomes very muddy. Now we're going to go to Ford's Theater, April 14, 1865. The simultaneous assassination of Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Henry Seward was planned. The idea was, let's take out the President, let's take out the Vice President, and let's take out the Secretary of State. That is the line of succession to the presidency of the United States. If the President is killed, the Vice President becomes President. If the Vice President is killed and the President is killed, the Secretary of State becomes President. So the idea was to throw the Union government into chaos. That was, the idea behind killing these three guys. By murdering the president, two of his possible successors, Booth and his co-conspirators, hoped to throw the U.S. government into disarray. That has never happened. We have never had a president and vice president assassinated, and hopefully it never does happen. And then if we go further and we get the Secretary of State assassinated at the same time, all three of them, I don't even know how that one works. There is a very specific line of succession, and it goes through the different cabinet secretaries, and eventually you get to the Speaker of the House as part of this as well. But off the top of my head, I can't tell it to you, and I bet that it would be very difficult for the officials to figure this out. I remember when Ronald Reagan, yes, I'm that old, when Ronald Reagan was shot, and Alexander Haig, who was not even part of the line of succession at the time, said, I'm in charge here. Went right past the Vice President of the United States. So my point is, the government officials can confuse this. So can you imagine the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State had all been assassinated? They weren't, fortunately. So now we go to Ford's Theater. Our American Cousin is the play. And at 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth fired a .44 caliber shot into Lincoln's head. Goes in from behind. The guard is not there. This is where the conspiracy idea gets a little better. The guard is not there guarding Lincoln's box. People that were supposed to go to Lincoln that night canceled out. Ulysses S. Grant canceled out. The conspiracy supporters, if you like, are using this as information and as evidence that there was a larger conspiracy at play here and involved a lot more government officials. But nevertheless, that's a debate. These are the facts. So, Booth leaps onto the stage and shouts, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants," the Virginia state motto. Booth breaks his leg but manages to leave the theater, runs away on horseback, and he is accompanied by a guy named David Herod, and we'll get to him in a second. A doctor in the theater, this doctor named Charles Leal, was the first doctor on the scene. He was in his early 20s, and the only reason to be pointing it out is he was fairly young and probably inexperienced, and boy is the adrenaline pumping now that he's attending to the stricken president. Lincoln is not dead. Lincoln is paralyzed. Lincoln is having difficulty breathing, and next thing they do, he's carried to a house across the street and placed on a bed. Lincoln's personal physician is called. He examines Abraham Lincoln, and he says that Lincoln is not going to make it through the night. Mary Todd is in the next room, and she is beside herself with grief. Lincoln is too big for the bed that he's lying in, so they have to place him catty corner to corner across the bed, and they even charge $1 a person to come view Lincoln as he was dying. Imagine that. Capitalism and the assassination of a president. Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. the next morning, and Andrew Johnson was now President of the United States. By the way, not the last time A. Johnson becomes President of the United States after the President is assassinated. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Union soldiers were searching for David Herald, and they were searching for John Wilkes Booth. Remember, Booth had broken his leg. So they stop off at Samuel Mudd. Dr. Samuel Mudd's house. They knew Samuel Mudd. He had been part of the introductions with John Surratt. There is some discussion that John Surratt, who lived with his mother Mary Surratt, that her house had been the place where this conspiracy was planned. She claimed no, but it didn't matter. She's going to still be arrested for the conspiracy. She claimed she didn't know anything about it. Mudd did help John Wilkes Booth. He supposedly didn't know anything about the assassination either, and Mudd will later be arrested and jailed for this, saying that he didn't know anything about it. People weren't buying that, and they thought he was part of the conspiracy. And they then sought refuge from this guy Tom Jones, no jokes please, a Confederate agent, and they end up going across the Potomac to Virginia. So there they are hiding out. On April 26, Union troops surrounded this Virginia farmhouse where Booth and Herod were holed up. They forced them out of the farmhouse. They tried to force them out of the farmhouse. They set fire to the barn. Well, once they set fire to the barn and now the main building, Herod gives up, but Booth remains inside. Booth was seen, supposedly, with a gun in his hand, and he was shot by a Union soldier. So Booth will now die before Booth can be questioned to any extent. His last words, useless, useless. We can only guess that he's talking about the attempt to take out the Union leadership. We don't know, historians don't know if he was unaware that Vice President Johnson lived and the Secretary of State Seward lived. We don't know that. 4 Booth's co-conspirators were convicted for their part in the assassination and executed by hanging on July 7, 1865, including Mary Surratt. She became the first woman ever executed by the federal government. We don't know about state government. She was the first woman ever executed, hanging, by the way, by the federal government. And it was interesting. It was a bright sunny day, and she was given a parasol as she stood up on the gallows, and they were putting the noose around her neck. So imagine the paradox. Let's be gentlemen while we're going to execute her. She claimed innocence until the end. And John Surratt, you might be wondering where he is. John Surratt fled the country. He ends up in Canada, and then ultimately England, and finally Italy. And he's going to be arrested and extradited back to the United States. And by the way, all this occurs after his mother and the other 3 co-conspirators with her are executed. He's going to be put on trial. And John Surratt, by an 8-4 decision, is going to be found not guilty in a curious trial. In a curious trial, the judge didn't really like the way things had gone, and he was debating ordering a new trial, and that was stopped. There was no new trial, and John Surratt lived out his life. So interesting. We don't know, and we can't prove what he knew about this. Was he part of the original conspiracy? That is largely believed to be true. Was he part of the assassination conspiracy? Not known. All that can actually be connected, if you connect the dots, is that he was part of the original attempt to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. But it doesn't matter, because the people who killed Abraham Lincoln were Southerners. They were Southerners who wanted the Civil War. If it wasn't going to continue, they certainly wanted the South to maintain some kind of high role, or some kind of role of supremacy in the post-Civil War years. So when Lincoln is dead and Johnson is now president, there's going to be a lot of kickback in the United States government against the South. And that's going to lead to something we call radical Reconstruction, which is going to be based on the Wade-Davis bill. And the Wade-Davis bill is largely punitive. So let me get back to that note set, and we'll continue and take more of a look at that. So based on all those events, the North is going to try to punish the South. And if you remember, Lincoln's party had been the Republican Party, and the Republicans largely overseeing the war effort. The Republicans are going to oversee the Reconstruction effort, and the extremists in the Republican Party were called radical Republicans. And they embraced this Wade-Davis bill, and we're going to get something called radical Reconstruction. President Johnson and Congress disagreed on how to respond to Southern resistance. The Klan is starting to rise up. Leaders in the South are trying to set up their local governments again based on the old-fashioned Southern ideas. So in March of 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act to ensure equal rights for former slaves. Because what are they trying to do to the former slaves? They're trying to make them tenant farmers and sharecroppers and sign contracts they couldn't read, and prohibit them from going places, and prohibit them from property ownership. And that's not going to work for the radicals. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. Johnson vetoes it. Congress overrides. So Congress and Andrew Johnson are not getting along too well. The 14th Amendment passed in 1868. The 14th Amendment basically says everyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, and no state could restrict his rights. Interesting that we passed this. We're saying every person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. So you know what that means? That means all the former slaves are now citizens in the United States. Well, it's logical then we're going to get another amendment. And that amendment, as you see, is going to be the 15th Amendment, and that is going to give all citizens, all male citizens, the right to vote. Imagine how that's going to go over down south. Then, as a way to make sure that these laws are followed, the 14th Amendment, Civil Rights Act, Congress is going to pass the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. And it's just what it sounds like. The Army is going to go into the South and control the lives of the Southerners. I want to show you what this looks like on a map and go into it specifically. So the way this works is, the former Confederacy, Southern part of the United States, can be divided into 5 districts, 5 military reconstruction districts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each of those is going to be controlled by a general. So we have 5 reconstruction districts, 5 generals. So basically, the Union Army is going to be an occupying army over the vanquished, over the losers of the Civil War. And we're going to have martial law. Let's back up and let's go through this now. The Radical Republicans passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, and Johnson vetoed it. But they passed it anyway. They overrode his veto. Overriding Johnson's vetoes was not something that was unusual during the Reconstruction time period. The act sought to rebuild the governments of the South using the northern states as a model. So each southern state was supposed to have a government like a northern state had. A governor, a legislature, a popularly accepted, elected legislature, and so forth. So let's make it as a model of the North. They had to include statements about the rights of the freed blacks. They had to accept, certainly, the Civil Rights Act. They had to accept the 14th Amendment. 5 military districts, as I said. Union generals controlled them. And you can understand how annoying and how difficult this is going to be for the South to accept. They're going to pass a series of laws and rules called black codes in which they try to get around these regulations. And Johnson is really going to fight with Congress over this. And the person who's going to oversee this whole military reconstruction is a guy by the name of Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton had been Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War. So now we're going to put the Secretary of War in charge of the generals who are each in charge of one of these military reconstruction districts to oversee the reconstruction of the South. Very much a feeling of resentment, a feeling of we have to fight back, a feeling we have to do something about this is going to occur between the old Confederacy and this military occupation. So you can see that Edwin Stanton is not going to be a friend of Andrew Johnson, and this is going to lead to the Johnson impeachment. So we have people walking around with bullseyes on their back. Andrew Johnson has a bullseye on his back from the Radical Republicans. Edwin Stanton has a bullseye on his back from Andrew Johnson. So, Andrew Johnson, Edwin Stanton clashing over radical reconstruction and military reconstruction in the South. Okay? In a way, or in an effort to protect Edwin Stanton from Andrew Johnson, Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act. Right there. The Tenure of Office Act says that no presidential appointee can be fired without the approval of Congress. It's a little hokey, because presidential appointees are appointed by the president, and the president should be able to fire him. Well, the problem here is Edwin Stanton was appointed by fan favorite Abraham Lincoln, not Andrew Johnson. Stanton is not Johnson's guy. So Congress trying to make it so that Edwin Stanton is protected and that Johnson won't fire him. Well, then Congress goes out of session, and Congress is allowed to do that. They leave and go back to their districts. They go into adjournment more than once a year because they represent their local districts and they have to go back and speak to their constituents. And while this occurs, while Congress is not in session, Andrew Johnson turns around and fires Edwin Stanton. But realizing how unpopular this could make him, he picks Ulysses S. Grant to be the new Secretary of War. So now Ulysses S. Grant is brought into this thing, and he does not want to be brought into this thing. At first, Grant doesn't know what's going on because Congress is not in session, and then he realizes there's a whole rhubarb about this, and Ulysses Grant says, no, I'm not taking this job. This is a bad idea. So Congress comes back, and they accuse Andrew Johnson of violating the law. Well, Tenure of Office Act was a law, and the House of Representatives turns around, lots of Republicans, they vote to impeach Andrew Johnson. Now, impeachment does not mean losing your job. A lot of people say that when a president is impeached, he's out of office. Not true. Impeachment means being put on trial. You and I are put on trial, and public officials are impeached. So what happens here is the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives vote to impeach Andrew Johnson. He will then face trial in the Senate. And the charge is going to be that he violated a federal law and he's committed a federal crime by firing Edwin Stanton. Okay, so now we go to the Senate. And the Senate is going to hear all kinds of evidence. They're going to examine the situation, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to preside over this and actually sell tickets to the Andrew Johnson impeachment. Well, once it all is out there, it becomes obvious that this is a really a political game of showmanship, and this is all about exercising muscles. Who has more power, the radicals in the House of Representatives or the President of the United States? So when the Senate votes on Andrew Johnson's innocence or guilt, Andrew Johnson is found innocent by one vote. One vote saved Andrew Johnson's job. If he had been found guilty in the Senate, he would indeed have been out of office. But that didn't happen, and that has never happened. 2 presidents in the United States have been impeached. Articles of impeachment are filed by many presidents. Any Congress can file articles of impeachment, but the House has got to approve those articles, and once they're approved, the president is said to be impeached. 2 presidents have had that happen to them. One was Andrew Johnson, and the other was William Jefferson Clinton. Both of them survived the trial in the Senate, and both of them continued to function as President of the United States. However, both of them, at some point after that, had diminished power as a result of surviving the impeachment trial. Anyway, so Andrew Johnson has survived. 2/3 of a vote is needed to convict Johnson, and Johnson makes it by 1 vote. So you see, he's going to really have his wings clipped after this. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is going to pass. The 15th Amendment guarantees all males born in the United States, they are already citizens under the 14th Amendment, shall now have the right to vote. Okay, so what that means is the former slaves, the male slaves, now have the right to vote. Imagine being a suffragette. Imagine being one of the women who've been fighting for equality for women, and side by side for equality for free blacks, and before that for the abolition movement. What a kick in the teeth that is, that the former slaves get the right to vote before you do. The 15th Amendment should have contained women as well as former slaves. They should have just cleaned it up right there, and the whole voting issue in the United States could have been handled with 1 pen stroke by the President of the United States. Didn't happen. Didn't happen that way. The 15th Amendment grants all males born in the United States the right to vote. And who's going to be the largest voting bloc in the South? It's going to be Republicans in the South. And who's going to make up the large group of Republicans in the South? It's going to be the former slaves. For a while. That will change. But imagine how that's going over. Because remember, the South is divided. South is divided into those Reconstruction districts. So these rules and regulations and laws are being enforced by men wearing dark blue uniforms who belong to the Union Army. Specific Reconstruction legislation, just to go through it with you. There are several pieces of legislation, and again, this chart is available on the website, www.buschistory.net. But anyway, we have the 13th Amendment, submitted and ratified in 1865. 13th Amendment frees the slaves, submitted in January of 1865. Lincoln is there for that one. Formally ratified by the states in December of 1865. Lincoln is not there for that. So Lincoln does not see the formal implementation of the 13th Amendment, although he knows it's coming. The Freedmen's Bureau is set up. Freedmen's Bureau, I alluded to in the beginning of the presentation, is a bureau that's set up to attend to education, healthcare, and housing for the former slaves. It sounds great, but what it's also going to do is going to set up segregation, because the people who are in need of these special programs and special attention are all former slaves. They're all black, and that's going to cause a black-white society. And an even uglier part of that is, in many cases, the people who are ministering to the needs of the former slaves are the former Confederates, because it's a job for them. And you're going to have the former Confederates teaching class, and you're going to have things like, okay, now, all you colored children, you understand where your place is in white society. You got a right to a job, but your job is going to be to serve the white man or the white woman in much the way you used to when you were on the plantations and the farms. So you can imagine that being drilled into a child's head, that they're second-class citizens in those schools. And the problem is, that was probably the view of the day. I'm not saying across the entire United States, but a significant part of the population may have been for freedom, may have even been for the right to vote. But the question of full equality, I think that doesn't work too well in 1870 in the United States. I think there's a lot of people who certainly will want full equality, but I think there's more who really believe in a class society in which whites rule and blacks have opportunities, limited all be they, have opportunities and certainly no slavery. So this is going to be a tough one. Civil Rights Act of 1866 gives citizenship to African Americans. This is before the 14th Amendment. You need this, you need the Civil Rights Act to get to the 14th Amendment, because an act can be declared unconstitutional. So how do you make sure it's not declared unconstitutional? You get the act turned into an amendment, which is essentially what the 14th Amendment is. The 14th Amendment is really the Civil Rights Act now adopted into the Constitution. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867, they are part of military reconstruction. They outlaw the Ku Klux Klan, and they establish basically that the radicals are really in charge of Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment, submitted in 1869, formally ratified in 1870, that gives former slaves, every male born in the United States, the right to vote. Angers the women, because they do not get the right to vote as part of it. The Klan Acts, which have been mentioned earlier in the 14th Amendment, they're going to be passed in 1871, basically outlawing the Ku Klux Klan. If you ever saw the beginning of Forrest Gump, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, yes, he was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan supposedly was born in Tennessee, and it's post-war years, and the white sheets, if you like, were as a way of terrorizing the former slaves. The slaves were very religious, they were very superstitious, and they believed that the Klan represented the ghosts of the white soldiers who died in the Civil War. And it was a mind game, it was psychology. And that psychology was used very potently, for sure. And finally, we're going to get the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and that's going to protect the rights of blacks in public places. You might think that that already occurs under the 14th Amendment, but there's significant challenge to those things as we go through. We have things called black codes. Black codes are laws which restricted where blacks could go and what they could do in those places. Sometimes they're called Jim Crow laws. There's a subtle difference. It really doesn't matter. You end up with the same point. That's a restriction on the movement and the rights of blacks in the South. Those don't occur in the North to any degree. You have places they can go. Can they be in town? Can they congregate? Can you have collections of black people on street corners, in public places? Can they eat in the same places? This is the grandfather of segregation in the United States. This comes out from the Freedmen's Bureau, not necessarily intended, but if we can purposely separate blacks as part of the Freedmen's Bureau, then why can't towns and cities as well? And that's where we're going to get the black codes from. People who come from the North and are investing in the South, whether it be economically or politically, are called carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers, the name comes from the fact that their bags, their luggage, if you like, was made of the same burlap that was used in carpet. And they came from the North to the South often bringing money, investing in cheap land that was available, or getting politically involved to gain their power. It was basically Northern Republicans who were investing in the South. Now, scallywags were Southerners who adopted the Republican ways. They were co-conspirators, if you want, with the Carpetbaggers. They were Southern whites who decided if you can't beat them, join them. And they became members of the Republican Party. Other stuff that was going on, you had debt peonage and sharecropping and tenant farmers. All three basically mean the same thing. Sharecropping, someone could have a farm divided into pieces, and one piece will be given to a former slave named Jim. Another will be given to a former slave named Clem. Another will be given to a former slave named Tom. And they will be told that if they want to farm that land, the land isn't theirs, that they have to give a share of their crop to their former master, who now owns the land and is sharing the land with the former slave. The catch here is they signed contracts. And very often, those contracts were not readable. Former slaves couldn't read in most cases. And it was found when you examined those contracts bound Jim, Bob, and Tom to the land for 25 years. And not only that, they didn't just bind them to the land for 25 years, they had to give up 2/3 of their crop. So the slave ended up doing the same work he was doing before, but now it's legal. That's part of what we call Jim Crow laws. And the same thing occurred with debt peonage. It was labor contracts between the former masters and slaves in which they worked but didn't actually share the crop, but they worked on the farm. Again, written so the slave didn't understand it, all kinds of terms that benefited the former master. And tenant farmers, the same idea. You can live on the land and you have to pay me. Now you can pay me what you can pay me in crops, hence your sharecrop, you can pay me rent. It didn't matter because this stuff was not read to the former slaves and they couldn't read it, and in some cases they found themselves in a situation of bondage all over again, except this bondage was supportable by law. Because one of the Jim Crow laws, which is not unusual, was that a black man could not take a white man to court. So we talked about earlier restoration versus reconstruction. The South is trying very hard to restore themselves to the situation they found themselves before the Civil War, in which they were supreme over the blacks. The Klan we had already mentioned, the radical Republicans we have, and then we're going to have Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes is going to run for president in 1876. Erase that. Rutherford B. Hayes is going to run for president in 1876. He's going to run against a guy named Samuel Tilden. Let's take a look at the electoral map. There's some interesting outcome with that. What you have behind me is the electoral map of the election of 1876. If you look carefully, you'll see it really is pretty even. The green is Samuel Tilden. He's a Democratic president for the United States. And the red is Rutherford B. Hayes. He's the Republican candidate for the president of the United States. If you examine it, by the way, this map is available in the YouTube folder on the Busch History website, which you can access. I'm not going to show this entire PowerPoint that goes along with this. I'm trying to do this a little differently this time. But this is part of that PowerPoint. You'll notice that it looks pretty even. That the amount of red states and the amount of green states are pretty close. And they are. They're very close. As a matter of fact, Samuel Tilden has 51% of the popular vote. 4,300,590. Rutherford B. Hayes has 48%. 4,136,298. Well, simple logic would dictate Samuel Tilden wins the presidential election. But neither one had a majority of the electoral votes. And you know where that goes. House of Representatives. Well, the House of Representatives is going to have to decide who will get this presidency, Samuel Tilden or Rutherford B. Hayes. Well, we've had a long series of Republican presidents. Lincoln, Johnson kind of, Ulysses S. Grant again, and the nation is growing weary of Reconstruction. It's growing weary of the debt that's rising because of it. It's costing a lot of money to oversee the South. The former Confederate leaders have now taken their positions in the Senate and the House of Representatives again, and the nation wants to put the Civil War behind it. So Rutherford B. Hayes in the House of Representatives stands up and says, I pledge that if I become the next President of the United States, I will withdraw the troops from the South, and a sense of normalcy will return to the United States of America. Reconstruction is complete. Well, it's a compromise. The Southern Democrats go for it, and Rutherford B. Hayes becomes President of the United States in 1877, in March of 1877. And what's the first thing he does? He removes the troops from the South. When Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president and he removes the troops from the South, that is the official end of Reconstruction in 1877. So Reconstruction begins in 1865. We'll use January of 1865 because that is the 13th Amendment. And it ends in March of 1877 with the ascent of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency of the United States. Troops are withdrawn from the South. And if you use a little speculation, now that the troops are gone, what do you think is going to happen to the South? You got it. Restoration, not Reconstruction. The debate occurs. Reconstruction, success or failure. A simple logic is success. The nation is back together. Examine a little deeper, failure. Because what's happened is the South is in very much the role it was in before. It's going to be largely agrarian, backward compared to the North, a divided part of the country where blacks aren't slaves anymore, but they certainly are in a segregated society, and they're subject to all kinds of local customs and traditions that laws could not change. Laws do not change people, they change the law. So everyone who believes that blacks are inferior keeps that feeling. I have a story I like to tell. A woman I met in the late 1980s, her name was Shirley Booth. She was a real estate agent in Greenville, North Carolina. Shirley believed that blacks and whites did not belong in the same school, that they had different needs and different cultures. And this is in 1989. That is 112 years after Reconstruction ended. So, those ideas, those traditions, those customs are hard to stamp out with just the passage of the law. But nevertheless, Reconstruction ends in 1877. The South will call it restoration, the North will call it Reconstruction, the politicians will call it a success. It's not a success. It's simply put on hold until the civil rights movement of 1960s occurs with Martin Luther King, ultimately starting with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. So I'm going to leave this here for now. There is another presentation on Reconstruction. It's a series of questions and answers I'm going to go through with you. That's going to be called 13-2. Until then, have a great day. This is David Busch from Buschistory. Take care.